I turned to look at the young female intern who was standing with her face pale, with my amusement mixing with sympathy. On a steel table before us lay a dead body of a young man. He was sent here for an autopsy to determine the cause of death. From the records, this person died in a car crash after he had collided with a utility pole around 4 a.m. When the rescuers arrived at the scene, they could no longer find the pulse. I spent half an hour reviewing how to determine the time of death and how to examine the external conditions of the body with her. Next, I ordered the officers to start the process of dissection. "Did you have your breakfast yet, Faye?" I turned to ask the small intern, whose presence was requested by a staff in an emergency room to review forensic science with me. Poor her. "I already had my breakfast, Professor." It's common for intern to call an autopsy staff a professor. Her face grew even paler when the autopsy staff peeled the scalp over the face of the deceased, revealing the cranium. I eyed Faye in her lab coat, wearing a green surgical cap, a mask over her nose, and rubber boots. Her body seemed to shrink in this uniform. I smiled tenderly at the sight. "Come on, let's hurry up and finish the autopsy. I'll take you to lunch." I guided her away from the table, waiting for staff to open the deceased skull. "What do you think is the cause of his death?" I asked Faye, without any serious expectations. Back when I was just a medical student, I had only 2 weeks of forensic class. If I hadn't pursued a graduate degree in this field, I was relatively positive that I wouldn't be able to remember anything either. Faye turned to the body with an unsure expression. "Hypovolemic shock from excessive loss of blood? It's possible. Blood loss commonly occurs with injured patients from the accident. However, from the external appearance, we couldn't see any bleeding except from the nose and ears. There might be some internal bleeding. This person had a large bruise on his stomach and chest. Once we open his lung and abdomen, we should be able to see it. I don't think this person died from excessive loss of blood, though." Faye turned her head back to me skeptically. I wiggled my eyebrows at her. "Wait and see." The cranium was opened beautifully. Then the brain was transported onto the block. I guided Faye to look at the head that was exposed. "Bingo! A fracture of the skull base. Do you see it?" I pointed at a sign of cracks ran across the skull base for her to see. At first, we saw pink, frosty sputum dripping out of the nose, as well as other evidence revealing the mechanism of asphyxial death. His skull base was fractured, then blood from the cranial base entered his respiratory tract. This person must have been dead from choking in his blood. I saw Faye's round eyes align with excitement. She looked quite cute. After completing the autopsy, I drove Faye to the steakhouse not far from the hospital. Whenever the interns were sent to study with me, it was customary for me to take them out to lunch. Then I would drive them back to the ER so that they could continue with their duty. "Why did you choose to study forensic medicine, Professor?" Faye asked me while we were waiting for food. This was a popular question every intern would ask when I brought them to lunch. "I think it's fun. We communicate with people through words, but the dead communicate with us with their bodies. Depends on whether we would hear them. The dead who fell off the building could be determined as suicide, but then we found high levels of toxic substance in their blood. The dead are trying to speak to us, saying that, 'I didn't kill myself, doctor. I was murdered.'" Faye scrunched up her face. "Professor, you sent goosebumps all over me." I laughed. "Hey, it was just an analogy. If the dead one had actually spoken, I would have run for my life." "Are you still afraid of ghosts?" Faye said in a high-pitched tone. "Of course I am. I pray every night before I go to sleep." Faye and I laughed at the same time. I felt like this was a good opportunity. Actually, you don't have to call me Professor. This is not a medical school. Let's keep it simple. You can call me Bun." Faye smiled broadly. "Okay, you're very kind and you teach very well, Bun." I was going to thank her for that compliment when the sudden ring of my cell phone interrupted. I pulled it out and looked at the number. It was the name I had saved as Captain Aim. 3 words popped in my head when I saw his name appear on the screen during office hours. Those words are, "Something came up." I stepped out of the hospital van. Faye jumped down after me. I decided to take the intern along to offer her an experience at the crime scene because during out of the office hours, the intern who was on duty in the ER would be the one who performed an autopsy at the scene. I wore a black jacket with large alphabets forensics on my back, and the sneakers for agility. 3 of us, consisting of Faye, Anon, a male coroner, and I, walked into the building. Anon carried a bag in one hand, and while taking out a compact camera in his other hand, and dutifully take pictures of the location. This building was a condominium in the middle of the city. There was a small group of people gathering on the ground floor. They must be people who had been living there. My eyes wandered around the ground floor to take in the ambience and suspicious individuals. This was what I do automatically, even though it went beyond the call of duty. My duty lay where the dead body was concerned only. From the scene, I had to be able to tell who the deceased was. When did she die? What the cause of death was? And if it was necessary, I had to send the body to the forensic department of the hospital to perform an autopsy. The investigator would gather information from my report and determine the cause of death and identify the suspect or the murderer, along with other pieces of evidence. However, I liked playing this one game with myself. If this was a murder case, I would guess who did it without any solid evidence. I would keep the answer to myself and I would wait for the revelation from the police or wait for an identification test, like a DNA test. You may call it a gift, because as of present, my statistics still proved 100% correct. A police officer approached me. "Dr. Bunn." "Oh, Captain Aim." I sent a big smile to a tall, muscular man in the uniform who was a local investigator in this area. My hand gestured towards Faye. "Today I brought a first-year intern to observe the scene. Her name is Faye." I saw the captain sending gleaming eyes to the petite female physician. I surely wanted to take his picture and send it to his wife. "Okay then, please take the elevator this way. The scene is on the 5th floor." We moved to the elevator that was already opened. While we were in the elevator, the captain turned to talk to me. "There is a suicide note, Dr. Bunn. The older sister of the deceased has confirmed that it's the deceased handwriting. The deceased was diagnosed with a depressive disorder. We have found an awful lot of antidepressants and sleeping pills, as though she refused to take them after she was receiving it. We have inquired her sister, and she said that the dead woman was stressed because of her love life lately. Her boyfriend threatened to end their relationship, or something like that." I nodded in acknowledgement. From what I've heard, it's inclined toward the possibility of suicide, isn't it? "Ah, and you said that the boyfriend was the one who found the body, right?" "Yes. At 11:30 a.m., the deceased's boyfriend came to see her in the room. He said he knocked, but no one answered. She didn't answer his call either, so he went downstairs to ask for a spare key from the staff, claiming that the owner of this room suffered from depression with a possibility of suicide. He entered the room and found the woman hung herself from the shower head in the bathroom. He rushed to hug the body and almost carried her down to do CPR. Good thing the staff stopped him in time and swiftly called us." I made a small tsk sound. I preferred the dead body untouched. "Hug?" His hairs must have fallen all over the body. Captain Aim laughed. The elevator arrived at the 5th floor and glided open. I walked out and looked down the hallway. There was one room with a door open. A group of police officers and forensic scientists were standing in front of that room. Nearby the door, 2 people were talking to the police. One was a woman who was crying. The other was a tall man in a white shirt and grey slacks. His black hair slicked backward neatly. He was a good-looking fella, looking outstanding, especially when he was standing among people like this. "That's her sister and her boyfriend." Captain Aim quickly confirmed my suspicion. The reaction to the loss of our loved ones was different for each person. Some people would be angry, some would be sad, some would be struck by guilt. I looked at the man, the boyfriend of the woman who had died. His expression was calm, in contrast to the sister of the deceased, who was currently sobbing her heart out. His face and eyes didn't show any feelings. I kept this observation in mind. I walked by the forensic investigators who were inspecting the place, into the room. The captain led me to the bathroom on the left. The next thing I saw was a body of a 20-year-old woman with long hair. She was in a pink nightgown, hanging from the shower head, which attached to the bathroom wall. Her feet were above the ground, a round, four-legged plastic chair lying on the tile. The tips of her hands and feet had turned dark purple. Her face was bloated and turned green, tongue protrude. I heard a series of shudders sound from the compact camera in Anand's hand, while Faye stood there. Her face looked pale. I took rubber gloves out of the bag and handed them to everyone on the team. I approached the body and inspected the external conditions to look for physical evidence on the body, such as blood or hair. The deceased name is Jancha Sukyod, age 28. She used to work as a primary school teacher. She had just resigned from the position for 2 weeks. The captain said while observing my work. Her sister said that her depression had gotten worse. Her older sister was the last person who saw her. They had dinner together here at 7 p.m., and her sister went back at 9 p.m. I used my finger to press on the dark areas at the end of her feet and hands, and I tried to move her arm. She might have been dead for about 8 to 12 hours. It matches the time frame when she was alone. I stood on my tiptoes to look at the noose closely. It was a white cloth tied to the wall-mounted shower head. My eyes caught something unusual. Above the mark of the rope on her neck, there were a few small, long scratches, with bruises under the rope. I called Anand to take a picture of this area clearly. Faye approached hesitantly. What is it? I pointed at the mark. Can you see this? Looks like a fingernail scratch, don't you think? And this area looks a little too bruised. I turned to Captain Aim. Are there any signs of struggle in the room? I haven't seen it yet. The captain shook his head. Everything seems to be in its place. From what I've asked her sister, nothing has been moved. I reached out to feel the area of the bruise. I could detect laryngeal fracture, which would definitely not be found in the person who hung herself. I gradually exhaled and turned to the captain, who was standing there waiting for me in anticipation. I couldn't wait taking this body back to the hospital for a thorough autopsy. Sorry for dumping more work on you, Em. I was silent for a moment. This doesn't seem like a suicide. I'd like to send her to the forensic department for an autopsy. This woman was strangled to death, and then her body was staged as if she had hung herself. After completing the preliminary autopsy at the death scene, I took off my gloves and walked out of the room where the incident took place. I inhaled the fresh air outside deeply into my lungs. The body would be taken to the forensic department for a thorough examination. I was ready to dissect this case. There was much more work to be done. My heart was pounding, excited every time I encountered a murder case. I had already become addicted to this feeling. This was the reason I was totally in love with this profession. When this seemed to be a murder case, I started to play my favorite game. Who was the murderer? My eyes suddenly glanced over to the man who was identified as the deceased boyfriend, the person who discovered the body. His face remained impassive. Wasn't he grieving the death of his girlfriend at all, despite the fact that they had already broken up? His long, slender eyes looked back into my eyes, as though he was aware that he was being watched. I averted my gaze somewhere else. My heart was still pounding because of excitement. My gut was telling me that this guy was no regular person. He was hiding something. And considering his strong, symmetrical body with 5'11" feet height, I thought this man could easily lift his girlfriend and hang her. I hoped the police would be of the same mind about this person and take a thorough investigation of him. This man was a murderer, I decided, and I was confident that my 100% statistics would not be destroyed.